Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes, it's my God. Okay, do we have some? Yes. Okay. I want to say hello to people. Oh, where's the camera? Okay. Okay. Yeah, I don't know where my chair is. My chair online, but it's here. So. Okay, everyone. Okay. One, yeah, I mean, it feels like on some days in the class. Should I? So I think I can wait. Sorry, I'm just gonna have to start my sleep. Well, you're gonna say that you're going to yes, I think this is in and out. I've been in and out of this recording. I know that. I know I'm concerned about that. Should I say that? Yeah, so yeah. I don't know it. Yeah, that's right. That's oh, and then we got saved. Yeah, that's one I did. You know, so you're almost sweet. 27, 28, then 27, 20. So yeah, there's somebody doesn't check how last week this is. And I can start. So it goes out. Like, how far along are you? Oh no, I'm in Sussex. No, I mean, how far are you? Oh, I'll just finish. This is my book. Oh, so you're responding. Yeah, I'm responding. Yeah. No. So you're. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, I don't know what to do. You'll sign it.
I mean, I think we can have someone else sign it for the chair, so that when it functions, it's.
Yeah, we're still missing, two, like, we're missing active assets and we're missing two speakers
Yeah, so.
and the chair. So what should be?
It's already back.
Yeah, are there, and is there anybody online?
Yeah, we have to sign.
Okay, but what about an audience? I'm just wondering, should we wait a couple of minutes?
Okay.
Or just to see if somebody else comes, because we don't have much of an audience and
Yeah,
we don't have all the speakers.
for probably 5 more minutes, so.
Yeah, like, let's just wait a few more minutes. Just let them know that we're gonna wait a couple more minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, they can hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I didn't know that. Hi. We have our chair. Okay. Okay, so I think we're missing, yeah, we're missing Abdul Bassett. And Vincent. But I think it's. Yeah.
Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes,
Yes, we can.
Yeah. I welcome you to this important session. I don't know whether the discussants are all available. Abdul Basit Kasim. Is Abdul Basit available now?
Well, we have, I don't think about Abdul Bassett and Vincent are, but we have Paul and we have Tijiojo. So maybe the other two will join later.
What did you say?
we have 2 presenters already.
Okay, only 2. Is Olatunji Ojo available now? Okay, nice to meet you. You are welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
Stephanie Taylor? Not yet.
She is not here yet. Just
Yeah,
through discussion.
Nalo, it's nice to have you. You are welcome.
Thank you.
We have to exercise a bit patience to see whether the remaining 2 discussants are going to join us.
Well, I'm happy to start if you want, because they don't need to hear our. It's more for Jennifer our feedback, but obviously it's up to you.
Yeah, maybe in 2 minutes. We start in 2 minutes. Let's just give them the benefit of the doubt.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Lisa, you are the chair, so we listen to you.
Just 2 minutes. Let them see what they are up to.
Jennifer, I can see you're in Lagos.
Yes, I am. I'm the only one that's here. Yes, I'm in Lagos.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's actually been 20 years since I've been in Lagos. No,
Wow.
12 years. Yeah. Yeah, usually I'm up north. So, yeah, so it's nice to be in Lagos. Yeah. Yeah, most of the districts that I'm sorry, and then I was everything rolled up for 2 years. Yeah. I'm coming here. Carmen. Also. I can see I'm just about to know about. Yeah, it was just
Okay, I think we have to start right now because We're already behind schedule.
Yeah.
Let me welcome you once again to this important book review session. And I want to thank the Lagos Studies Association for providing us with this platform for the discussion of this important and thought-provoking book by Jennifer Lofkrantz of Gulf University for Science and Technology, entitled Ransoming Prisoners in Precolonial West Africa. This is a period before the evolution of the international laws of war. I mean, the study is a conversation, as far as I'm concerned, on the treatment of war captives or prisoners of war, POWs. And this actually has been an important topic on issues concerning forms of excessive practices of warfare, which ultimately led to the call for the moralization of warfare, which in turn culminated in the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which set the standard for the international laws of war. Jennifer used the West African case study as a window into the broader conversations on politics and practice of ransoming in other parts of Africa and in the world. And by so doing, it explores the discourse on slavery and ransoming before 1800, the policy and practice of ransoming in the Maghreb, the politics and not politics of ransoming during the Sokoto Jihad and the Jihad of Umar, respectively, as well as the negotiation and practice of ransoming prisoners. I mean, we have 4 seasoned scholars to discuss these central arguments of the book and then raise some questions which the author will address. With me to do justice to this, I have Abdul Basit Kazim of New York University, Paul Nello of Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, Olatunji Ojo of Brook University, Stephanie Tenle of University of Passau. I think we have 1 hour 30 minutes to discuss the book. So what I will do is to allot 15 minutes to each discussant, and then we use the remaining 30 minutes to raise questions as well as take response from the author. So may I invite Olatunji Ojo to blaze the trail.
Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. Again, thank you so much to the organizers, at least for inviting me to give my piece on the book. For a disclaimer, I've been familiar with the book since its inception some years ago. But I'm just gonna go straight to my view of the book. How do we comprehend the ideological justification of captivity and enslavement in contemporary and historical Africa? What were the ransoming practices and the place of ransoming in the sociology, ideology, and economics of pre-colonial Muslim African societies? What connections existed between ransoming and the jihad, as well as state systems in Africa? And what do we know of the anti-slavery basis of Muslim revolutions across Africa? In Ransoming Prisoners in Pre-Colonial Muslim Western Africa, Jennifer Lofkrantz offers an intellectual history of these questions by focusing on how West African Muslim scholars discussed captivity, slavery, and the slave trade. The book's argument is twofold. First, Lofkrantz argues that Muslim scholars used ransoming as a tool for curbing the enslavement and sale of freeborn Muslims. Second, Muslim revolutions, jihads, or religious wars, as they've been called, stemmed from attempts at reforming slavery, mitigate enslavement, and in part responses to failed ransoming negotiations in Africa. A bigger question, however, permeates the work, one that has implications as to how we understand early modern African Muslim societies, understand the motivations of Muslim scholars, and approaches taken by modern historians, religious scholars, and jurists to understand not just the Muslim scholars, but also the broader place of African societies and philosophers in the age of revolution. Grounded in extensive use of Islamic texts from North and West Africa, as well as the Middle East, commentaries and government and missionary archives in Nigeria, the UK, France, North America, as well as oral traditions, secondary sources. The book breaks new ground in West African intellectual history, Islamic traditions regarding slavery, enslavement, and ransoming. It opens a new window into understanding the socioeconomic underpinnings of Islamic revolutions in Africa since the 16th century. Also, it builds on existing works that detail how African Muslim scholars were fully engaged with the Atlantic and African slaving systems and wished to reform it, albeit to protect their followers. From this perspective, the jihad, certainly in West Africa, was more than a religious war. They were revolutions aimed at transforming society. Thus, Lofkrantz must be congratulated for showcasing African contributions to global political philosophy and intellectual history on ransoming. The book complements the effort not only to decolonize African history, but also to globalize it. Those reading the book to see a Muslim anti-slavery manifesto will be disappointed. Lofkrantz's central thesis is that Muslim authorities did not reject slavery. Indeed, they promoted it, especially the enslavement of non-Muslims and bad Muslims, those accused of diverging from Islamic tenets, so-called unbelievers. Rather, ransoming was a solution to a related problem: how to respond to the capture of free-born Muslims. Under this arrangement, ransoming prevented enslavement and must not be conflated with redemption, which released those already enslaved. Drawing on diverse political legal traditions from the Quran to the teachings and analysis of Islamic laws and traditions by the scholars, jihad was justified to spread Islam and for political and social reform, which often included releasing Muslims in captivity through ransom and punishing illegal operators. West African Muslim scholars like Al-Magili, Ahmad Baba, and the Fodios, to mention few, were products of their societies and eras. They embodied prevailing ideas around them. They were pragmatic, political, and understood the limits of their authorities. They engaged in a vociferous debate and disagreed, sometimes sharply, on the meaning and definition of a good Muslim, involving the related issues of the construction and reconstruction of racial, religious, and ethnic identities, which serve to distinguish insiders who are in principle protected from enslavement or due for ransom from others who are legitimately enslavable and could not be ransomed, as well as about the validity of the jihad. One of Lofkrantz's more persuasive arguments revolves around the extent to which a relatively small group of West African scholars were able to impose themselves on public opinion and on states as policymakers and administrators. The book shows how West African scholars offered a range of legal and political opinions that paralleled their more celebrated European and American contemporaries in providing the intellectual basis for political and religious revolutions in Europe and the Americas. The direct parallels between the rise of Protestant revolutions and national churches in Europe and Ahmad Baba's attack on Morocco for privileging race and Northern African Islam over Muslims in West Africa, or the near simultaneity of the French and Haitian revolutions and the formulation of Fodio's policies in Hausaland cannot be ignored. Ransoming prisoners is divided into 5 chapters arranged chronologically. Chapter 1 discusses West African Muslim intellectual backgrounds, scholarly discusses on slaving operations, with emphasis on isolating legal from illegal enslavement, and the value of ransoming as a remedy against illegal enslavement between the 16th and the 19th century. The discourse draws on the sociology of West African societies, school curriculum, local and regional laws and ethics, and explores the insertion of West Africa into Atlantic and Mediterranean discussions about the rights of citizens and the duties of the state. Chapter 2 to 4 are the most substantial part of the work. With a focus on Northern Africa, Chapter 2 addresses historical ransoming operations in Afro-European relations with an emphasis on tension between Christian Europe and Islamic Africa. It details the religious, economic, and spatial foundations of captivity, enslavement, and ransoming relations. It shows how kidnapping, piracy, warfare, and other violent methods, as well as ransoming, all connected to issues of imperialism, territorial control, commercial and religious competition, labor recruitment, ethno-nationalism, and investment when people try to make profit of the commoditization of human bodies. Chapter 3 on the Sokoto Caliphate explores the intellectual contributions of the Fodio family, Usman, his brother Abdullahi, his son Mohammed Bello, and the daughter Nana Asmau. Their education, intellectual backgrounds, and connections within the wider Muslim scholarly tradition going back to the 15th century. In this chapter, Lofkrantz considers how the application of Islamic laws, such as the state, offering to cover the cost of ransoming poor Muslim captives and barring the ransoming of enemy prisoners, influenced Sokoto's policies on slavery and ransoming. The chapter highlights some of the challenges facing the caliphate in its inability to fully prevent unjust enslavement, including disagreements among the Fodio, first between Usman and his brother Abdullahi, and later between Abdullahi and his nephew Mohammed Bello, but also between states, between Sokoto, specifically Bello, and Borno, led by El Kanemi. Chapter 4 pivots to the Western Sudan, that is the Umerian state. And for those who might not know, we're dealing with the regions of modern Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, northern Sierra Leone, northern Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Mali, and places as far as western Niger. Lofkrantz argues that the Umerian state constituted a continuation of socio-political reforms in Upper Guinea that dated as far back as the 16th century Futatoro, aimed to protect freeborn Muslims from violence associated with the collapse of the old Songhai Empire, the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, and European imperial expansion through Senegal and Sierra Leone. Ransoming negotiations and tactics from the point of captivity to the release of captives, the agency of captives, diplomatic and personal negotiations, the calculation of prices, the importance of class and wealth in deciding who gets ransomed, the role of the state in arranging ransoming and responses to specific cases of failed negotiations, the subject of the last chapter. If slavery divided a society between insiders and outsiders, ransoming offered a mechanism for coordination across social, political, and cultural boundaries. Ransoming expressed pragmatism in the face of political crises and drew upon an ancient and evolving African and Islamic traditions. Ransom brokers, whether diplomats, traders, or professional negotiators, provided formal and informal, open and behind-the-scenes opportunities for mitigating tension and resolving intergroup conflicts. Let me end on this point. Muslim scholars, like others, were men, not holy men, nor saints, though their followers often represented them as suprahuman, Mahdi, as some would call. These were people of their time and not above its follies. Women occupied a social stratum for these people. Yes, we have few scholars such as Nana Asmau, but most of the scholars were male and were more interested in the activities of men. So even though most captives in Muslims West Africa were female, we know more about the process surrounding the ransoming of men more than women. This is not Lofkrantz' fault. It is the nature of her sources. The book will be valuable to teachers and students seeking a unique perspective on the religious basis of violence, captivity, enslavement, and ransoming in Africa and in the Islamic world more broadly. Lofkrantz offers an appealing insight into pre-colonial African philosophers and political reformers, which will help the ongoing work of breaking Europe and the Americas' mental hold over enlightened ideas about citizenship, state practice, and reform. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ojo, for that incisive review of the book. In a nutshell, he insists that the book breaks new ground in West African history, Islamic history, as well as Islamic revolution in West Africa since the 16th century, arguing that it is an effort to decolonize African history and also to globalize it. Well, thank you so much once again for that. We will call upon you to raise questions if there are. May I, at this juncture, invite Paul Nemo to do justice to the book as well.
Thank you, Alisa. And thank you again for inviting me to be here. Thanks to the LSA for hosting this discussion. And I know Jennifer Lofkrantz's work on ransoming through her articles, very well cited articles on ransoming. And you know, ransoming has really been a sustained focus of her career, really. And it makes sense that the book is not only a combination of her previous work, but also an expansion of ransoming into areas that I was really not expecting to see in there, such as the Ottoman Empire and the Maghreb in general, and also in Northern and Southern Europe. And it's a real pleasure for us to have a book that is very closely focused on one topic out there in the world, because I don't know of any other book-length work that's only on ransoming. And so I wanted to ask the author, Jennifer, if she can explain why she focuses you know, so sort of doggedly and determinedly on this subject. You know, what is it? Maybe this is a sort of personal question, really, but it's, you know, why ransoming? You know, why does ransoming deserve such a sustained focus in your work? I'd be really interested to hear that. And certainly we have benefited from your sustained focus through this book and through your previous work. There were a couple of areas that I thought there were some interesting omissions that maybe I can talk about. So in chapter 2, you talk about you compare ransoming practices between Europe and the wider Mediterranean, and then also sub-Saharan Africa. And you make some very interesting links and divergences in the approaches to ransoming across both Muslim and Christian parts of the wider Mediterranean and African world. But I just thought, the sort of the clearest link between West Africa and the Ottoman Empire, up until the modern period, was the trans-Saharan slave trade, which passed through various West African kingdoms and then various provinces of the Ottoman Empire, to Cairo and then on to the Middle East. And so I was expecting a lot more of a discussion about ransoming on the trans-Saharan trade, and I wonder whether the absence was because there is simply no documentation of ransoming exchanges on this trade, or whether it was not customary that captives taken on this route rather than the Atlantic or in interstate conflicts were to be ransomed. So I'd be interested to hear about that. I mean, perhaps the most, even though myself, I'm a specialist on Sokoto and West Africa and Sahel region in general, I think the most interesting part of the book for me was the huge difference in the treatment of European captives in the Maghreb versus North Africans, mostly North Africans who were taken to Europe. And so you state that for the most part, the Moroccans and other nationalities who were taken to Europe were essentially treated as chattel slaves and made to work. And there was very little interest in ransom negotiations. And then whereas for Europeans in Ottoman territories, this was very much a bargaining chip for wider, political and monetary gains. And so that was a very interesting parallel, which I hadn't really considered before. But I also wonder, when we're talking about the 18th century and the Enlightenment in Europe, I mean, I wonder where the stories of Job Ben Solomon, you mentioned the African part of his ransoming, but you don't mention that the ransoming that he had in North America, and he came back, of course, to Britain, and he was sort of a celebrity in aristocratic circles. And his story is mirrored with many others in the Enlightenment period: Ignatius Sancho, Ottobacco Guano, and many others who were sort of certainly not worked like in the previous, maybe in an earlier period. They were very much became celebrities, and they were cultivated by the British aristocracy in this case. So I just wonder, where does this story, where does this approach to ransoming fit into this broader narrative that about the different treatment of captives between the Muslim world and the Christian world. And so moving on to Sokoto, and I think it's a really nice summary of obviously the foundation of the Sokoto state and the issues that the leaders of the state had to deal with in terms of large number of captives from the various conflicts in the region. But I do have a sort of issue with the concept of the triumvirate, and now it is tetravirate with the addition of Nana Asmao, which is nice. It's a nice term, but as you state yourself, the writings of Usman, of Abdullahi and Bello, a lot of the time they're writing these works to critique each other. And it's not exactly a government by a triumvirate. It's more a sort of conflict, really, as to what is the point of a Muslim state, and especially between Usman and Abdullahi, there's a huge division. And I'd like to kind of get your take as to, because if we follow this view of the official history of Sokoto, that actually prevents us from comparing, let's say Sokoto and Gwandu and their approaches to ransoming. And they were very different states, very different government structures, which has been completely glossed over now in the Sokoto studies, but they had very different approaches. And so I wanted to find out if you were able to discover in the primary sources or in your interviews any differences in the approach to ransoming between Sokoto and Gwandu, given that they were, pretty much separate states. Yeah, and that's all I have. Thank you again for this this really contribution. I'm afraid I have about half an hour left. I have to take my daughter somewhere about half. So I'm hoping I can stay for some of the discussion. But really enjoyed the book, and hope we can have a discussion about some of the issues that I raised. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for raising critical issues about the book. I think his is more of raising questions. And he expressed pleasure for us to have a book that is focused on one subject, namely the subject of ransoming. And then he was expecting discussion on ransoming across the Sahara during the trans-Saharan trade, and then noted the huge difference in the treatment of captives in West Africa and Europe, most especially the Europeans in the Ottoman Empire. And he was of the opinion that there is an omission of the incidents of ransoming in North America, and therefore wanted to know the difference between the treatment of captives between the Christians and Muslim world, as well as the difference in the treatment of captives and ransoming issues between the Wandu and also Sokoto Caliphate. Maybe we have to, at this point, invite the author to, answer some of these questions and see whether other people can also join us and continue the discussion. Jennifer, please.
Good. Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Great, thank you very much to Lisa for being chair, and for Tunji and for Paul for joining us. I know it's Saturday and it's mid-afternoon, early morning, mid-afternoon in North America. Yeah, so thank you very much for making time for this today. I'm not too sure what happened to our other panelists. So since Paul mentioned that he has to leave soon, maybe I'll start with his questions. Yeah, so why the focus on ransoming? This kind of came back to I guess like my dissertation research. Originally, I was supposed to do my dissertation on gender in the slave trade between Mali and southern Morocco. And then in reading the secondary literature, especially in terms of the French secondary literature, I kept noticing how mentions, especially like Mariusu and all of his students, they mentioned, oh yes, ransoming happened, but what was most important was enslavement of captives. And that got me to thinking about how does, if ransoming happened, if ransoming was a possibility, how does that affect our understandings of what African understandings of enslavement and of options of being taken captive? And so that's what really got me into it. And this is kind of related to one of your other questions about like North America. And we know, for example, that we have letters coming from Jamaica of where people who have ended up in Jamaica are sending letters back to Africa saying, hey, I'm here, send money, get me out of here, right? They're expecting that they're going to be able to be ransomed. Now, unfortunately, getting too much into what's happening in terms of North America was getting beyond kind of the scope. Like the way that I was able to include Morocco and Algiers into the book, that what was connecting was the shared the shared foundation in the Maliki Madhab, Maliki law, and what then and that was what's really especially interesting in Morocco, in terms of Morocco and Algiers, is how they were dealing with both foreign policy and dealing with captivity in terms of Europe, and of course they then had the southern and the relationships with states south of the Sahara, right? And so then, and then how do they deal with this issue? Now, in terms of the reason why I did not do too much in terms of actual cases of people being ransomed from the north back to West Africa, is mostly a question of sources. I just don't have the cases. Some of this has to do with the perhaps the nature of the trade, and that there's less records for the trade. Some of it might have to do with gender. Most of the cases where I have people being ransomed are men. And most of the people who are going across the Sahara are women. So I'm not sure if women were more valued
as slaves than they would be if they were then for the ransom money. I don't know. So I don't know if it's the nature of the sources and that these cases have not been recorded in any way, or if it's a nature that there was less ransoms taking place. We also know that there is less records of ransoms. So I'm not sure. Like I just don't have the sources to say anything about to say much about ransoms. Like I have cases of people being ransomed in the North Sahara, right? But those are of Europeans. I don't have cases of Africans being ransomed and returned south of the Sahara. West Africans being ransomed and returned. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. So I'm just trying to read my notes. It's kind of dark in here. Do we have lights? Okay. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Where? There was so many questions here.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's annoying when you get told why isn't something in your book, but
Yeah.
I think
Okay,
what
so
I was saying on the European, it wasn't necessarily that we wanted to hear more about North America, but I just wondered, was there a change in ransoming practices between that earlier period where you're talking about where essentially, North African captives in Europe were essentially treated as free labor? I'm talking like 1600s. You talk about, they're working as rowers on the boats and stuff, but then you get to the Enlightenment period, and it seems that actually these individuals who were unlucky enough to be taken to Europe actually became intellectual curiosities. And I just wonder, was there a palpable change in the concept of ransoming during that period, or just wanted to get your ideas on that?
I think the change was changing labor needs, and I think one of the things that look at is, are captives going to be more valued for the labor, or are they going to be more valued for the ransom money that they can bring, right? And this is something that when you try and decide what to do with a captive, do you want to kill a captive, ransom a captive, exchange a captive, enslave a captive, just let the captive go, right? You kind of like you're balancing these things. So I think it comes to like labor versus money. And I think that the Europeans, especially in the earlier period, were really valuing the labor, right? They had a labor shortage. And so they were valuing that labor. So they preferred to keep these North African captives for their labor and basically enslave them. And whereas on the North African side, on the Moroccan and the Algerian side, they valued the money that they could get back, especially from the lead captives. So I think that's the main difference. And as the labor needs decreased for the Europeans, right, then it's more interesting. And of course, the Europeans also had on the eastern frontier, right, when you're looking at the Austrian-Hungarian and Ottoman border, right? There's a long practice of ransoming captives back and forth across that border, right? So that I think that's all kind of like context that goes into the European ideas of keeping people captive, keeping people captive. Also, what happens is that you have the peace treaties that are signed between European states and Morocco and Algiers, and that's really in the late 1700s, and that's really going to cut down on the people who are going to be taken captive, right? Because they're agreeing not to do that anymore. So you have less people being taken captive. In terms of the Saqqara Caliphate, I was like the sources that I had, like, really I'm kind of concentrated on the writings of Uthman Abdullahi and Muhammad Bello and Nana Asamu, and so then so it's kind of like access to writings. And one of the things that's kind of difficult with studying ransoming is that there's really it's trying to find sources. Like they're all scattered, right? So like there's no kind of like central registry for ransom cases. For me to find ransom cases, I was just going through lots and lots and lots and lots of different correspondence, letters, all sorts of registries, biographies, all sorts of things in order to get cases of ransoming. And it's the same thing with policies. It's like I'm going through individual treaties and letters to try to get what these opinions are. Like they're not, there's not kind of, unfortunately, nice solid manuscripts just on ransoming, or a nice set of policies that lay out everything, right? And so some of it is it's the sources that I'm trying to deal with and trying to get that picture. And then the other thing that I was trying to do in this book is use ransoming as a hook to explore those greater questions that were going on in the region, which was, who is a Muslim, what interpretation of Islam should dominate, what should be the role of Islam in the state, and who gets to decide, right? And so I'm trying to then use, and that's also why I kind of concentrated on the writings of these initial intellectuals who were setting the tone for the caliphate, which then subsequent leaders either followed or not, right? In terms of things. But yes, like the question about the Sokoto-Gwandu divide, I think, is a really important question. And I haven't gotten the sources to really explore that. Maybe someday. But I'm also trying to, as you said, I have spent most of my career on the issue of ransoming, and I'm hoping that this book will be kind of like the culmination of my contribution on the topic of ransoming, and that hopefully other people will pick up the topic of ransoming, especially in other places of Africa, because I really do think that ransoming and the possibility of ransoming affected how people viewed captivity and enslavement and their options about when somebody is taken captive. And then it also really affects who ends up in the slave trade. So then it really does have an impact on what happens in the Americas, what happens across the Sahara, and also the ideas that people brought with them into when they were trafficked across these regions, right? So it's not something that I think can be ignored when we're trying to understand African ideas about freedom and non-freedom. So that's kind of what comes up to it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that elucidation. But I think there is one question that is still outstanding, namely the disparity between the Christian and Muslim world when it comes to the practice of ransoming. I don't know whether you have addressed that.
Yeah, so they both practice. Well, actually, all societies practiced it. I focus more on ransoming in Muslim West Africa, but all African societies did this. Non-Muslim African societies ransomed. The reason why Muslim societies in West Africa were able to ransom back people was because non-Muslim societies also practiced it. And in fact, Tunji has wrote an article on ransoming in Yorubaland. So that's something to be said. But what you do have is ransoming, and the traditions of ransoming, are obviously set in different legal traditions. But also what is interesting is that the Christian, what we see that Christian laws, like European Christian laws, are actually being based mostly on Spanish and Portuguese laws, which on the Sierra Petades, which actually kind of came from understandings of ransoming coming from Spain and from Andalusian Spain. So the Spanish at first basically based their laws actually on their understanding of the Islamic legal tradition in Spain, and then of course then made differences. One of the commonalities, though, that's important between Southern European Christian understandings of captivity and freedom and Muslim understandings in the Mediterranean is that they're similar in that both were based on religious identity. So Christians, so people and Europeans were taking North Africans captive and could enslave them or keep or hold them for ransom because they were not Christians, not because they were North Africans. And the same thing, right? North Africans were taking Europeans captive and either enslaving them or ransoming them or doing other things with them because they were not Muslims. So in that sense, they actually kind of shared, right? Some kind of like similarities in terms of their belief is that they were basing it on religious identity. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think
Can I just chip something in quickly?
yeah, I want to invite you to raise some issues as well. Yeah, Tunji, go ahead.
Two things. Let me quickly maybe sort of add to Jennifer's point as well as maybe provide some answers to some of aspects of Paul's questions. Starting with the Christian-Muslim divide, I think one advantage Europe had was Europe just had the sheer luck of having more documentation available. It's much easier to access documents out of Europe going back several centuries. I mean, something that is seems more difficult in Africa. The issue of like central libraries, the archives, had a very long tradition in Europe, whereas in the case of Africa, it developed, relatively late. We do know, for example, that not later than the 13th century, you already have Christian brotherhoods, denominations, or call them NGOs or philanthropies or whatever, that they were sending out funds, to ransom, quote unquote, enslaved or detained Christians in North Africa. I mean, that developed very late in Africa. Second, in Africa, the sources are simply very scattered. I mean, most of the sources up to now in North Africa seems to still be in private hands rather than in centralized libraries or archives. So that made for some of the disparities in in terms of sources. The second thing is also for us to clarify or to distinguish between ransoming and redemption. Paul had a question concerning how come that the book was short on bringing in experiences of Africans who were enslaved and ultimately became free and returned to Africa. Well, the point is, so their return was no longer a case of ransoming. That has now shifted to another stream, which what we call redemption. And one of the problems in Europe, today, is most European scholars never differentiated between ransoming and redemption. For them, it's the same thing. In fact, Jennifer will argue, and I will support that a good chunk of the so-called Europeans or Christians ransomed in North Africa were indeed not ransomed. They were redeemed. Because these were people that some of them, they've been in bondage for 10 years, 20 years, or even more decades. But I think the point that Jennifer is making is ransoming is a process that prevents enslavement. So when you've been enslaved, whatever happens afterward, you are no longer ransomed. Now you are redeemed. So it makes so there is no way in which the discussions around the issue of ransoming would have included Africans taken to the Americas because they've been enslaved. So any discussions around those groups will be about redemption rather than ransoming. I just want to chip that in quickly. Thanks.
I'll just add one thing to that is that it's also about the difference between ransoming and redemption is what happens to the person afterwards, right? If the person's able to truly return home and regain their status and retake up their life after their traumatic experience, right? Then they've been ransomed. If they have remaining in a subservient position in kind of like the new host society, or if they've been kind of like you know, their social status really been denoted, and they're no, and they've lost like honor and all that types of things because of the of what happened to them, then I would say that it's more redemption. So the other thing to do, try to decide between, say, a long-term captive and a short-term slave, is what is their life like after they've been freed. And that's another way to differentiate between who's ransomed and who's redeemed. But yes, it's very important. And one of the things I've been trying to fight against is differentiating these two concepts, right? Because we do see in literature, when it's being discussed, this conflation between ransoming and redemption. And especially when I first started working on ransoming, that people didn't really know what I was talking about. They thought I was really talking about redemption. They're like, well, you're not really saying so it's really important to differentiate between these two concepts. Yeah, thank you, Tunji.
Yeah, thank you, Tunji and Jennifer, for that clarification. I mean, from what you have said, I deduce the fact that ransoming is a priori, is a process that happens before enslavement. Yes. Why redemption is a posteriori, exactly. after enslavement. Yeah, thank you. That is very important, so as to enable us to situate the conversation within its appropriate concept and context. With regard to the issues raised by Tunji, because we are trying to make a disparity between the sources available in Europe and also in Africa. You are saying that the reason why one cannot have in-depth analysis of ransoming in Africa is because of the dearth or scarcity of sources. But what you are saying is that you are now discounting the place of Timbuktu in African history, because we know that Timbuktu University harbors a great library and also archives that will enable us to reconstruct the history of pre-colonial Africa.
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
Yeah, let me answer that. Well, this is why this is what basically I discussed in chapter 1, right? So, so the types of sources that I have for ransoming is that I have legal treaties, right? And I have these sources from Timbuktu, and from other places, right? So, the first part of the book, I'm discussing what legal scholars say from the 1600s onwards about ransoming. Okay, so that's definitely one source. And like I said, I have these legal treaties like Ahmed Al-Magili and Ahmed Baba and these others, and what they say about ransoming, right? And then as Paul pointed out, I rely a lot on what the Danfodios say, right? Because this is another source, right? They wrote on ransoming. So like we do have these treaties. That's one set of sources, right? But then getting into say more of the policies, and then getting into actual cases, right? So because I use a lot of individual, trying to get individual cases and qualitative information, and that is what's really scattered. So when you look at, say, for example, sources on slavery and people who have been enslaved, especially if you're looking at the transatlantic slave trade, you actually have registers, right? Like take a look at the transatlantic slave trade database, and that's all based on the fact that you have these ship manifests that list all sorts of information about the individuals who they're transporting to the Americas. That type of centralized registers or lists do not exist for ransom. Like ransoming, I don't have like a list of like in any sort of record, whether it's an Arabic record, a Sakara record, or early colonial record of ransoms of like somebody compiled a list of people who've been ransomed. Instead, what I have to look through is all sorts of different types of correspondence, letters, individual letters, biographies, the early colonial sources where you have correspondence, especially for the French. The French actually had like, so for Mali and for Niger because of just the way that the French kept records. And they kind of kept a running kind of diary of what's happening in their local sector, their local region. I comb through all of that and I'd find mentions of, oh yes, this person was ransomed for X amount of money, or they'd have people who came to them, to a French official, to complain that a ransom negotiation had failed. So we had, so we have those types of things, but as Stingy, because Stingy is quite familiar with this work, and when I was putting it together, it's very, very scattered. It's just don't have the same centralization of lists that you have for, say, for example, for slavery. So that's the issue.
Okay, thank you. I think Paul has left.
Yeah.
Yes.
But let's continue with the conversation. We still have enough time.
Okay, thank you.
For the avoidance of doubt and also for the benefits of the audience, it will be nice to paint a picture of the occasions that were responsible for captivity in the first instance. What gave rise to the captivity? That's one. Then the second point here is, who was responsible for ransoming? Is it the victim of captivity, or the family members and friends, or the state of the victim? Who is responsible for this?
I think that most people in the audience, and actually we haven't had time to ask the audience for questions. The audience might have questions too.
Okay.
But let me answer this first. Is I think most people are familiar, is that most people who were taken captive, right, were war prisoners. This is why I call the book Ransoming Prisoners, right? And most people who ended up being enslaved in Africa were prisoners, were war captives. But then what do you do with a war captive, right? There's really only 5 basically practical things you can do with a war captive, which is you can kill the war captive, you can let the war captive go, you can exchange the war captive against prisoners held by the other side, you can enslave the captive if there's a market for slaves, or you can ransom them, right? And so what I'm looking at is ransoming. Now, in terms of who's responsible for paying the ransoms, this is one of the topics that I talk about in terms of the Dakota Caliphate. And this is one of the issues that was debated in the Dakota Caliphate, which is exactly that, who's responsible. And so the Dakota Caliphate tried to, ultimately is going to say, yes, the state is responsible, but what they try to do is put the costs back onto the family. So they're saying the family needs to pay for the ransoms. They will help facilitate the negotiations for the ransom. And then each emirate was supposed to have a fund to pay the ransoms of poor people, poor good Muslims, like people who truly could not afford to pay ransom. However, what I noticed is that in the correspondence is that really trying to get the families and to raise the money themselves. I even have a couple of cases where the local emir is telling a family, it's surely you can raise more money. Go ask another relative. Raise the money. They're really trying to put the cost of ransoming back onto the families. But there was supposed to be a fund to pay, and you certainly had Sokoto officials and emirate officials who were helping to organize and pay the ransoms. Organize the negotiation of ransoms and help facilitate the exchange of the money and the return of the individual. But the governments did try to avoid payment if they could.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. I think at this point we have to invite those of the audience to raise questions if they have, or even make comments. After that, I will come back again with some questions. The audience, please, do you have questions? Do you have issues? Do you want the author to clarify?
We have a question. We just need to move the microphone, yeah.
I think everyone can hear me.
We need a microphone for the,
Thank you. I'm not a historian or in any way an expert on the topic, but I am wondering, in your opinion, are there any contemporary phenomena that link to this notion of ransoming that you're looking at and where do you see it, and how does that relate to the notion of caliphate today?
Really good question. And yes.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that's a really good question. And it is something that I try to do in my book a little bit, is to try to make kind of explicit the connections and the non-connections between past ransoming practices and current day ransoming practices. Because as we know, in Nigeria, throughout Nigeria, right, people being taken captive and ransomed is an issue. And you have two types. One type is the purely criminal, we just want profit from this person. And the other type of kidnapping and ransoming that takes place does have an ideological and political aspect to it, especially when we're talking about the Boko Haram crisis up north. And so what I try to explain in my book is that the similarities between what happened in the 19th century and what's happening now is kind of looking at the types of choices that people have. So looking at, it's based on, like I can go into it, so it's based on understanding the past West African canon and past ransoming practices, right? That kind of gives an idea of what's kind of acceptable, what's not. And also what are your choices when you take somebody captive? So what I remember is, I remember when Shakal kidnapped the Chibok girls, right? The school girls. And he put out a video where he basically said, it's like, look, either you pay ransom for these women, or you exchange them for Boko Haram prisoners that you're holding. And if you do not do that, then I'm going to enslave them, right? And that's basically what he did, right? And so the choices get back down to the same thing. It's like, what is the understanding of your so-called legal choices, what you decide, right? And then what are kind of like your cash and labor needs? But it also comes down to, I think, also it gets back to the question is, who's considered to be a Muslim, right? And who gets to decide this? Because a lot of the street-back girls who were taken, some of them were considered themselves to be Muslim, but they were still kept. And when you change this to, so for example, when Islam took people, they kidnapped girls from a school. The name is just escaping me at the moment. But what they did is that they ended up releasing the girls who were Muslim and who were self-identified as Muslim. They recognized their Muslim identity, released those girls, but kept the girls who did not self-identify as Muslim. So for that, right, there's that, it still comes down to that question of who's a Muslim and who gets to decide, right, what that identity is, right? Because what happened in the Dakota Caliphate too, and Tunji kind of talked about it that aspect of my book, right, is that the Dakota officials had a very narrow view of who they considered to be a Muslim, right? And so they were concerned about the freedom of the people who they consider to be a Muslim, and they were not concerned about the freedom of people who they did not consider to be a Muslim, even if those individuals consider themselves to be Muslims. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know whether there is any other one that wants to ask question, or do I go ahead with mine?
Yeah, there's two more questions.
No, so for example, were they taking people from the warehouse direct to Rancy without much resistance?
Okay.
So was the Sokoto Caliphate, were they ransoming people from Borno?
Okay, so with the Sokoto Caliphate,
With the just like not full. With the Sokoto Caliphate, you had two things. So one thing is that they were expanding on their borders outwards, but at the same time, they also did not have full control of their internal borders, right? So depending on the different emirates, they may or may not have full control. There's a lot of rebellions, a lot of people who did not want to be part of the Sokoto Caliphate, even if they were kind of like in the interior. And then what you also had was also then a lot of illegal captivity. So when there was a legal enslavement and a legal slave trade, there's going to be illegal enslavement and an illegal trade. So you have two things going on. So yes, you had the war with Bornu, and certainly the Sokoto Caliphate did not consider Al-Kanemi and Bornu. They defined them as non-Muslims, right? So this is something that was kind of like, so too did this is something very that Umar Al-Hajj Umar did too, is that they would declare a leader to be takfir, and they basically self-define these people as non-Muslims, and then therefore it's then legal, right? So you have captivity being taken on different levels. So I think what's most important is whether or not the government, right, considers you to be a Muslim or not. If the government considers you to be a Muslim, then they will make efforts to ensure your ransom. If they did not consider you to be a Muslim, then they were fine with you being sold, being enslaved and sold. Does that answer? Yeah. Yeah, answer.
I think so. So,
Yeah.
so for example, if were people being enslaved by people not in the government, like so something how actually ransoming people who were being internally enslaved who were Muslim.
Yes, so because one of the things that the Sokoto Caliphate was very concerned about was this issue of illegal enslavement, and this is the main issue for why they're setting up these funds to ransoming. So ideally, what they would have wanted is, and this is going back to Ahmed Baba, and this is something that the Sokoto, like Uthman and Abdullahi Muhammad Bello, they all agreed on. What is ideal is that if you, as a Muslim, suspect that perhaps maybe the person you are holding is also a Muslim, you are supposed to let that person go and just swallow the economic loss. Unfortunately, that's not very practical. Only the most pious of people are going to do that. And so this is why the Sokoto Caliphate supported ransoming, is because it ensured that the person who they think should not be face possibility of enslavement, it ensures that person becomes free, and it then compensates the owner. So this is why they supported ransoming. Ideally, it's not what was supposed to happen, but it was the very practical way to solve this problem of freeing people who they thought should not face the possibility of enslavement.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a question. We have a question here in our Q&A box from Lisa El Castillo, a historian and an independent scholar in Brazil.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Lisa wants to know whether you found any cases of ransom of captives who would have been sold into Atlantic slavery. If I am not mistaken, Mahoma Bakaku, a Boguman who ended up a slave in Brazil, was captured a few times before eventually being sold to Brazil. And that in the first instance of capture, he was ransomed by his family. He arrived here, I think, around 1840. Did you find any other cases like that? That's what Lisa wants to find out.
Yes, there's actually, and this is also another thing that got me into looking at ransoming, is actually an article that Sylvia Njayouf wrote. It's in the book Fighting the Slave Trade, where she looked at the ransoming of individuals off of slave ships. And so what you had, right, and so she contextualizes it differently, but it's ransoming. So what you had was people who are following people down the coast and were actually able to pay for the ransom of and get people off slave ships. Also, like Tunji Ojo and I, in an article that we wrote for Journal of African History several years ago, we also discussed cases of people who are being ransomed, and also failed ransom cases where the ship sailed before the ransom was brought and paid, and the ship captain refused to wait, and so the ship sailed. And there's also letters. I think Tunji may know more about this than I do. From Muslims in the Caribbean who were writing letters back home and basically saying, "Hey, I am here, right? Send money, right? Get me out of this." So with the expectation that there can be a financial transaction to be made that would then send these individuals back home. And I think in terms of Brazil, like Mariana Candido, in one of her books, it's just kind of like a mention, but she mentioned in terms of Angola, where there's kind of like cases of ransom negotiations happening for individuals who, if they were not ransomed, actually would have ended up in Brazil. So I think Mariana has a couple of cases of that. If that answers your question, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you. I think Lisa has just sent a message of acknowledgement that the book sounds fascinating and that the discussion has been extremely enlightening. So I think you have done justice to her question, apparently.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think when you talk about captivity, as well as ransoming, these can be described as forms of excessive practices of warfare. And in that case, I want to find out vis-a-vis what eventually happened in Europe, because in Europe, at a time, they began to think of how to moralize warfare, which gave rise to the Hague Convention of 1899, as well as that of 1907, where issues about how to handle captives, prisoners of war were discussed. And I want to find out, did we have such kind of laws in Africa, or maybe in Western Africa, by the period of your conversation? Did we have laws describing how prisoners of war, how captives, war captives should be treated?
Certainly in the Islamic tradition, you most definitely have laws and guidelines about how captives ought to be treated. And then of course there's always that gulf between how people, what's supposed to happen and what actually does happen. And I see Tunji was nodding his head, and I think he can probably say something a little bit more about Yoruba laws. Yeah, if you want to jump in and say something about that, because like I'm more familiar with the Muslim laws, and I think Tunji can say something about non-Muslim Yoruba land.
Okay, thank you. Yes, every society has I mean, it's various ethics, surrounding violence or surrounding intergroup relations, conflict resolutions, peacemaking negotiations, and so on. So whatever the Europeans did in the 1890s, it's just part of the ballpark. It's something that is customary to every society. Let me give an example. In West Africa in the 13th century, there was an exchange between Borno authorities, which is modern-day Borno State in Nigeria, and Egypt. And the question was the treatment of citizens. Because for the Borno authorities, the argument was we are Muslims, and as a result, our citizens should be free to travel commercially in the Muslim world unmolested. But what happened was in North Africa, and again, Jennifer made reference to this in her book, that in North Africa, in spite of seeing several West African societies as Muslims, race also played a very big role for North Africans. Yes, they might see a West African as a Muslim, but also they see the guy or woman as Black, and North Africans as not Black. So for the Egyptians, one of what they did was attacking Kanem traders traveling through Sudan towards Egypt or towards Arabia. So the letter specifically from Kanem was, hey, you, the king of Egypt or the leader, what's going on? Tell your citizen to stop troubling our citizens, that we believe we are both Muslims and this shouldn't happen. The same thing happened in Angola in the 16th century, when there was a letter from King Alfonso of Angola to his counterpart, the King of Portugal, criticizing or attacking Portuguese slavers operating along the coast of Angola. And again, the argument then was, well, we are Christians, so we should see each other as brothers, rather than you using your European racism to attack our people. And this is across every society. And it's not just limited to ethnic considerations. There are also issues of class, such as, well, you are doing this to us because we are poor, or you're doing that to us because we are rich. And as a result, specifically to Sokoto, by the 19th century, one of the policies put in place by Sokoto was to post officers to strategic toll points along the trade route to inspect every trade caravan and find out if Muslims had been captured illegally and been trafficked to be sold into slavery. And if such people were found, the idea was to set them free. So those are some of the ways in which people recognize, what Olisa is talking about in terms of laws regulating slavery. Every society has this, but beyond that, there were also negotiations, and that's the essence of ransoming, across enemy lines, across cultural boundaries, where two societies, even when they were at war, do have ways or negotiations and free their citizens from harm.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tunji, for that. I don't think there are other questions on the table, except if...
Actually, there is a question
Okay.
in the audience.
Okay, please. We still have about 10 minutes to go, so let's enjoy the privilege.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm joining the conversation very late, so I apologize if this question's already been addressed, but I was inspired by some of the earlier questions. I was just curious about how Sokoto state builders are performing Muslimness, like how, besides like a monopoly of violence, how do they justify what's legitimate Islam versus illegitimate Islam? Is there like a drawn up family tree going on that is like how exactly is it being performed or justified? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so the leaders of the early leader, actually basically all the leaders of the Sokoto Caliphate were actually very well trained in fiqh. And it's a Maliki madhab, and the Qadariya Sufism. And it's a particular interpretation of that tradition. Right. And so they are part of what they're doing is that, yes, they wanted to reform society in terms of their version of and their interpretation of law. And the person who was actually very much instrumental in kind of ensuring the spread and the continuation of what I call the Sokoto tradition was actually Nana Asamu, who was Uthman's daughter, who was a scholar in her own right. She was fluent in several languages, wrote treatises on various aspects across a wide aspect of topics. But what she was really important in doing was she established the education system. And what she did is that she really emphasized the education of women, because women are the first teachers of children. And also what you did is that you had a lot of women who are being integrated into elite households through concubinage, right? And then of course those children are going to become a part of the elite. And so what you want, and those children, their first teachers are going to be their mothers, right? So it's trying to get those mothers on side. Plus, they're also very much interested in raising the education level of all women. Uthman Denfoldier actually placed, and actually the Denfoldier family, even before Uthman, had always placed an emphasis on the education of women. They viewed the education of women to be as valuable as the education of men. So there's also that aspect. But what Nana Asamu did is that she established this education program that, yes, taught, right, the Uthman Denfoldio and interpretation of the Maliki Madhab and Qadiriya Sufi Brotherhood, but also taught the Sokoto version of events. And so taught like the Sokoto interpretation of the jihad that brought them to power, right? The Sokoto interpretation of the past, right? And so in terms of to try to then kind of make sure that this kind of like tradition continued on. But yes, they wanted to reform society according to their vision. Now, what actually happened is not, again, there's this difference. Like one of the complaints, like there's is that this wasn't really like a lot of there was a lot of like going back to pre-Sokoto kind of political traditions, especially like pre-Sokoto like Hausa traditions in terms of titles, in terms of way that things were set up, that people were not really following what this intellectual said. This has a lot to do with how the Emirates set up, because what Uthman did was that he would give a flag to somebody who would then go and say conquer an area, right? And then that person then became the emir and is in control, right? And so that person had a lot of decision making, especially since Sokoto was more of a confederation, right? It didn't even have the ability to an army. Like when they wanted an army, when Sokoto wanted an army, they had to ask the emirs, the emirates, to send troops, right? So there was a lot of different things going on in the different emirates. So so it was kind of a little bit haphazard how much they're able to change things. But really, any sort of continuation of the Sokoto kind of tradition, the promulgation of it was probably the education system and a lot of what Nana Asamu did to get it past that first generation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you will agree with me that it has been a wonderful and glorious intellectual moment. And as a result of that, I want to thank Jennifer for giving us this incisive and thought-provoking book. Let me also thank Olatunji Ojo for being present and for also reviewing the book in a wonderful manner, as well as intervening on various occasions to contribute to the clarification of concepts and issues that we needed him to clarify. I thank Paul for coming, notwithstanding that he had emergency and he left at a point in time. I also thank the audience for staying with us all through the moments of our intellectual engagement. And finally, I want to express our profound admiration and gratitude to LSA for organizing this session. So at this moment and at this point in time, I want to thank all of you and bid you farewell and all the best in your subsequent endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.